Chapter 1. Silence departing from New Orleans. New Orleans awoke beneath an unusual hush that morning. The final days of November had brought an unexpected chill to the normally humid city, and a thin veil of fog clung to the Mississippi River like a whisper. At Union Passenger Terminal, where the scent of old iron mingled with the distant murmur of steam, the Grand Midnight Rail stood waiting, its deep black exterior, trimmed in sleek silver lines, stretched elegantly across the platform, a serpent of polished steel, prepared to slice through the heartland of America. Detective Elliot Graves stood near the edge of the boarding platform, his hands in the pockets of his dark overcoat. Though not a tall man, he carried himself with a quiet weight, like someone who had seen too much but chosen to speak of little. The faint brim of his fedora shaded observant eyes that rarely missed at detail. He was not supposed to be here, not on this train, not on this morning, but a telegram had arrived the night before, short and unsigned. Only 5 words. Board the train. Watch closely. Graves had learned to heed such messages. Over the years, he had seen the consequences of ignoring the inexplicable. So now, without a formal case, without a destination of his own, he found himself walking toward car number 3, the first-class sleeper reserved under his name. The conductor, a lean man with sharp features and a crooked smile, greeted him with a nod. "Mr. Graves, right this way." As he stepped aboard, Graves surveyed the other passengers. A senator's wife in furs glanced up from her newspaper. A traveling nurse with sad eyes adjusted a heavy satchel. A man in a beige suit, far too expensive for the dust on his shoes, offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Everyone, Graves thought, seemed to be traveling for a reason they weren't sharing. The train lurched gently as the final whistle blew. Outside, the city began to slide away, giving way to flatlands, telephone poles, and the long breadth of the rails. Graves leaned back in his seat, fingers laced across his stomach, and closed his eyes. He didn't know what awaited him in the cold northern stretch between New Orleans and Chicago, but he knew, as he always did, that silence never stayed silent for long. Chapter 2. Strangers on the Rails. The midnight rail moved northward with a rhythm that seemed to lull the air itself into quiet submission. Its wheels carved a steady pulse into the frosted tracks, slicing through Louisiana's fading wetlands and into the early hints of winter. Inside the first-class sleeper cars, time seemed to stretch and settle into its own peculiar pattern. Polished mahogany paneling, velvet seats, and golden wall sconces gave the train the air of a forgotten luxury, a world cut off from the noise of cities and the rush of clocks. Detective Elliot Graves sat near the center of the car, eyes half closed, observing without staring. He had learned long ago that people revealed more when they didn't think they were being watched. In front of him sat a former senator from Vermont, his name barely legible under the fold of his newspaper, but the polished cufflinks and congressional pin betrayed him. Across the aisle, a Broadway actress whose face was once lit by stage lights now hid behind tinted sunglasses and a stack of gossip magazines. Her perfume reached Graves before her voice ever would. A few seats back, a nurse adjusted the strap of her canvas bag. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were exhausted eyes that had seen too much of life's final chapters. Behind her, a sharply dressed Latin American businessman spoke into a silver phone in hushed Spanish, pausing often to glance toward the windows. His voice was smooth, but too measured, like someone trained to lie with rhythm. Further down, a young woman of East Asian descent sat stiffly beside the window, looking out at the blur of barren trees. Her coat was immaculately pressed, her hair pinned tight, but her posture carried the weight of diplomacy. Perhaps the daughter of a consul or ambassador, Graves guessed. Aged but refined, an elderly couple sat sipping from matching porcelain cups. Their coats were tailored, their glances brief, but knowing they didn't speak much, but they didn't have to. Decades of shared silence sat between them like an invisible guest. The train had gathered more than passengers. It had gathered stories, all from different places. Arizona, Maine, Texas, Illinois, strangers in geography, but united in posture. Quiet, careful, guarded. There was something about them, Graves noticed, that didn't quite add up. Not one of them seemed truly at ease, as if they were actors in a play no one had rehearsed, each waiting for their cue to speak lines they hadn't yet written. He felt it in the tension between conversations, the glances that darted but never landed, the silences that stretched just half a second too long. Whatever had drawn them to this train, it wasn't chance. Not entirely. Something tethered them here, something they either didn't know or wouldn't admit. And Elliot Graves, without fully knowing why, began to write their names in the back of his notebook, one by one, quietly, just in case. Chapter 3. The First Glance. The hum of the train filled the silence between seats, a constant rhythm that smoothed over awkward introductions and subtle tensions. Elliot Graves, who had spent the last hour observing the strange orchestra of strangers in the first class car, was finally approached by the man who had boarded shortly after him, Martin Russo. Russo took the seat across from him with the careful energy of someone who didn't trust stillness. Mid-50s, thick hands, a gold watch that gleamed too much for discretion. His suit was designer but rumpled, as if he dressed to impress and forgot to iron out his fears. There was a tightness in his jaw, the kind that came from years of always looking over one's shoulder. "You, Graves?" the man asked, voice low but firm. "I am," Elliot replied without offering a hand. "I know who you are," Russo said. "You're the guy who found that missing boy in Ohio, and the girl from the Brooklyn warehouse. Quiet type, real sharp, you know how to watch people." Graves didn't answer. That was, generally, answer enough. Russo leaned forward. "I think I'm in trouble." That caught Graves' attention. Not because of the words, but because of how they were delivered. Not panicked, not theatrical, just grim, like a man already halfway through his own confession. "I've been getting letters," Russo continued. "No return address, no signature, just ... threats. They started a month ago. I thought it was a joke. Then they got specific. Names, places, old stuff, things nobody should know." Graves said nothing for a long while. He studied Russo's face, every tick, every avoidance of eye contact, every dart of the hand toward the chest pocket where the man kept those crumpled letters. "No doubt, I need someone like you to keep an eye out," Russo said finally. "Just for the trip, that's all. I'm not asking for much." Elliot Graves glanced toward the window. The flat fields of Arkansas rolled by under a slate sky. "I don't work protection," he said simply. "I observe, that's all." Russo gave a bitter chuckle. "Observation might be all I need right now." They sat in silence for a moment. The train groaned slightly as it took a curve in the track. Russo tapped his fingers against his knee, the rhythm uneven, nervous. He wasn't used to asking for help. Graves could see that before the conversation could drift into further detail. A conductor passed by to check their tickets, interrupting the fragile moment. Russo leaned back, folding his arms, the walls of bravado returning. But it was too late. Graves had already seen behind them. He didn't take the job, not officially. But he did open a fresh page in his notebook that night and write one name, in clean, sharp letters: Martin Russo. Chapter 4. Snowstorm and Sudden Halt. By nightfall, the world outside the midnight rail had vanished beneath a thick veil of snow. Missouri's countryside, once a patchwork of fences, barns, and dormant fields, was now a seamless sheet of white. The train pressed forward, steady but cautious, its steel body groaning softly with each mile. The windows had frosted over, and inside the sleeper cars, the air had turned hushed, blanketed by the gentle rattle of cutlery, faint whispers, and the occasional sigh of steam from the heating vents. Elliot Graves sat in the lounge section, sipping lukewarm coffee from a porcelain cup that trembled faintly in his hand. The heat didn't reach his fingers. Outside wind lashed against the glass with a force that suggested it wasn't entirely welcome in these parts. Snow swirled like smoke in the darkness, lit faintly by the carriage lights that bounced off the surrounding nothingness. Visibility was gone. Beyond the windows, the world had become shapeless. About around 10 minutes past midnight, with no warning and no announcement, the train lurched violently. There was a sharp screech of brakes and a jolt so fierce that glasses toppled, passengers tumbled, and the lights flickered in protest. The midnight rail groaned to a halt somewhere in the middle of nowhere. No station, no signpost, just darkness and the endless howl of winter. Graves braced himself with one arm on the table, his other hand reaching instinctively for the notebook in his coat pocket. The atmosphere had changed. He could feel it, and then it came, a scream. High-pitched female, so sudden and sharp that it seemed to slice through the train's metal skin. It echoed down the corridor like a blade thrown through silence, causing heads to jolt upright behind. Cabin curtains and in sleeper berths, footsteps followed, doors cracked open, whispers turned frantic, then nothing. Silence returned, to complete, to final. As though the train itself was holding its breath, Graves rose without a word and stepped into the narrow hallway. lit only by the emergency bulbs that cast long, yellow shadows on the carpet. He didn't run. He never did. Panic blurred details, and Graves survived on details. The scream had come from the car just ahead. By the time he reached it, a conductor was already there, speaking in hushed tones with two startled passengers. One of them shook her head repeatedly. The other simply pointed toward the far end of the corridor. "No one's hurt," the conductor said quickly, noticing Graves' approach. "Just a scare. We're checking the lines ahead. Might have been a snowdrift. Nothing mechanical. Everyone, stay calm." But Graves didn't believe in such easy explanations, not when the scream had sounded like someone who had just witnessed something they were never meant to see, and not when the train was now, for the first time on this journey, completely still. Chapter 5. The Murder Compartment. Morning arrived without warmth. The sun, if it had risen at all, was little more than a faint, silvery smear behind the snow-laden clouds. The midnight rail remained motionless on its icy track, imprisoned by the storm that had buried Missouri. Overnight, passengers stirred quietly, wrapped in blankets and confusion. Breakfast was delayed. The lounge car was quiet. Whispers moved faster than the train ever had, and then the conductor knocked on Elliot Graves' door. "Sir, you'd best come see this." Graves didn't ask what it was. He simply followed. Down the corridor they moved, past sleepy faces and tired glances. Near the far end of car 3, a small crowd had gathered in hushed murmurs. A woman with trembling hands gripped a rosary. A man rubbed his forehead over and over, as if trying to erase the image from his mind. The door to cabin 3B was open, but only just. Inside, the cabin was dim. The curtains had not been drawn back, and only a narrow sliver of cold light crept in through the frosted window pane. Martin Russo was there, or what was left of him. He sat slumped in his seat, the collar of his dress shirt soaked in a dark bloom of red. The white fabric looked shredded, not torn in a single clean motion, but stabbed again and again. Graves counted silently. 12 wounds. Some shallow, some viciously deep, scattered across the chest and abdomen. There was no pattern, no raged at the most disturbing detail, however, was not the body itself. It was the room. The door had been locked from the inside. The train conductor had to use a master key to enter after multiple unanswered knocks. The window was sealed shut. Signs of forced entry. No broken glass. No footprints in the snow outside. It was, by all appearances, an impossible crime. Graves crouched beside the seat, his gloved fingers brushing the edge of the side table. No sign of a weapon. No blood trail beyond the corpse. No disturbance to the few items in the room: a newspaper folded on the armrest, a whiskey glass only half full, and a torn matchbook from a New Jersey hotel. Everything else was too still, as if preserved. "He was fine last night," the conductor muttered. "We checked every cabin after the emergency stop." He didn't answer, but that wasn't unusual. Graves rose slowly. "Seal the door," he said quietly. "No one enters this compartment without me." The passengers, once merely unsettled by a storm, were now trapped with a murder committed in silence, behind a locked door, in a room that shouldn't have allowed it. And somewhere on this train, someone had returned to their seat with blood on their hands, and a secret colder than the snow outside. Chapter 6. A Dark Past. Elliot Graves had always believed the dead spoke, not in words, but in echoes, documents, photographs, forgotten fingerprints on faded memories. And as the snow pressed against the windows of the stalled midnight rail, Graves sat in the dining car with a leather folder spread open before him, the contents smuggled quietly by a railroad official who remembered the face. Inside was the past Anthony Morello had tried to bury beneath a new name, Martin Russo. He had changed the haircut, the voice, the suits. He had even grown a mustache, but it hadn't been enough. There were records old, yellowing arrest reports, newspaper clippings, mugshots barely touched by time, and there was one name that made Graves' jaw tighten as he read it: Emily Monroe. She had been 8 years old, daughter of a town schoolteacher in Ohio, vanished from her backyard one late summer evening while her father was fixing a porch. Light, there had been a teddy bear left behind, a tiny shoe in the tall grass, and, weeks later, her body was found in the river, wrapped in a floral bedsheet. The case had shocked the state, and Anthony Morello, a traveling contractor with a criminal past and no alibi, had been arrested, but not convicted. Lack of evidence, circumstantial testimony, a lawyer with sharp teeth. He had walked out of the courtroom a free man, but not a forgotten one. For years, he moved city to city, job to job, changed his name, paid in cash, kept his head down, and now he was dead, murdered in a locked train compartment with 12 knife wounds and a past soaked in blood. Graves stared at the photo of Emily Monroe. The image was black and white, a smile frozen in time, framed by 2 missing front teeth. So many people had failed her. Maybe someone on this train had decided to fix that dot. Who among the passengers had known? The former nurse with the haunted eyes, the senator's wife who kept watching others more than her book, the quiet, observant elderly couple, a daughter, a sister, a parent, a friend. Someone connected to Emily Monroe could be sitting just feet away from where the man who likely ended her life had taken his final breath. Graves folded the file shut. This was no random killing. It wasn't greed. It wasn't passion. It was memory sharpened like a blade and used 12 times. The midnight rail wasn't carrying strangers anymore. It was carrying ghosts. Chapter 7, The Conductor, and the First Clues. Frank Delaney had worked the rails for nearly 20 years. He knew the weight of snow on steel, the rhythms of wheels beneath his boots, and the silent language of nervous passengers. But he had never seen a corpse before, at least not one, freshly made in a locked cabin under his charge. He stood stiffly beside Elliot Graves as they re-entered cabin 3B, his hat clutched in his hands like a man walking into church. Graves knelt beside the body once again, careful not to disturb anything. The cold had already preserved Anthony Morello Martin. Russo sat, just as they had left him, slumped, bled out, face strangely peaceful for someone who had met the knife 12 times. But now, Graves wasn't looking at the man. He was looking at what was left behind. First was the cigarette butt, not unusual, except for the lipstick smeared along the tip, faint but visible in the morning light. He held it up with tweezers, frowning. Russo hadn't smoked in front of him, and certainly not anything with floral-scented lipstick. So either he'd had company that night, or someone wanted it to seem that way. Next came a shred of deep red velvet, caught in the splintered wood along the edge of the bunk. It was barely an inch wide, but unmistakably from a garmenta sleeve or a dress. Perhaps soft, expensive. Graves pocketed it in an evidence envelope, and then, under the seat, just visible where the shadows met the baseboard, something torn and pale fluttered in the draft. A scrap of a letter. Delaney handed Graves a pencil so he wouldn't smudge the ink. The page was uneven, ripped from a longer note, but the handwriting was large, fast, furious. Only one fragment remained legible. Emily's revenge has come. Graves read it twice. The words weren't clever. They weren't designed to mislead. They were raw, direct, emotional. The kind of thing a person wrote in a moment of fury, not planning a murder, but justifying one. He looked up at Delaney. "Have your staff check every compartment," Graves said quietly. "Uniforms, luggage, anything velvet, anyone smoking menthols with lipstick on the end. And I want to know who requested dinner to their room last night. Someone didn't want to be seen." Delaney nodded and left without a word. Graves remained, staring down at the dead man, now surrounded not just by blood, but by the first whispers of motive. Someone had waited years for this moment, carried the weight of memory across states and seasons, and finally struck here, where the snow kept secrets and the train carried no way out. This wasn't just a killing dot, it was a sentence. The storm still howled outside, but inside the midnight rail, the real chill had settled in the corridors, with the bodies sealed away and the evidence tagged. Elliot Graves began what he knew would be the most grueling part of the investigation, not the forensics, not the theories, but the talking. One by one, each passenger from the VIP cars was summoned to the rear lounge, where the coffee had gone cold and the silverware had been cleared away to make room for quiet confessions. Graves didn't accuse. He listened. The first was the senator's widow, a tall woman with perfect posture and a tone sculpted by decades of diplomacy. She claimed she hadn't left her cabin after dinner. She'd taken a sleeping aid, couldn't remember the storm, the scream, or the sudden stop. Her answers were neat, timed to the second, too cleaned up. Then came the Broadway actress, wrapped in a shawl and sunglasses despite the dim lighting. She was theatrical, emotional, eager to help. Claimed she'd heard a door slam in the night but wasn't sure which one. She had trouble remembering where she was when the train stopped. "I dream in soundtracks," she said. "Everything blurs." The nurse was quiet, too quiet. Her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her bag while her voice offered soft, uncertain answers. She remembered hearing someone crying in the hallway, or maybe laughing. She wasn't sure. "I was tired," she said. "I've been tired for years." The Latin businessman barely made eye contact. His suit was sharp, but his words were dull, flat. He claimed he hadn't left his seat after 10 p.m. He'd made a call to Miami, then read until sleep took him. "You're wasting your time," he said to Graves. "We're all victims of the weather." The young Asian woman was the only one who asked questions in return. "Why him?" she said. "What could he have done to deserve that?" She hadn't known the victim, or so she claimed. She'd gone to bed early, didn't open her door all night. Her eyes were red not from crying, Graves noted, but from lack of sleep. And the elderly couple, gentle and composed, simply said they kept to themselves. The woman had taken tea. The man had read aloud from a travel guide. They heard nothing, saw no one. But Graves wasn't listening to their stories. He was listening to what they didn't say. The inconsistencies were quiet, but there, a door some remembered opening that others insisted stayed shut. A hallway some swore was empty that others claimed was filled with shadows. A scream that rang out in different tones in different ears. And then, the most telling detail of all, not one of them asked about Martin Russo by name. No one said, how was he killed, or did he suffer? Not even the ones who had spoken to him the day before. Graves leaned back after the last interview, alone once more with his notes. Everyone had offered a version of the night, and none of them matched. Chapter 9, The Red Velvet. Elliot Graves had returned to his cabin only for a moment of silence. The interrogations had worn thin on his nerves, too many half-truths, too many eyes that shifted left when they should have looked straight. He needed stillness, reflection, a wall of quiet where thoughts could echo into clarity. But the moment he entered, he knew something was wrong. It wasn't the air, though, that felt strangely disturbed, or the lighting, which flickered from the cold. It was something instinctive, as if the room had been breathed in by another and exhaled in haste. He shut the door slowly, then turned toward the sleeping berth. The blanket was untouched, his coat still draped over the armrest exactly where he'd left it, but something near the top of the bed tucked just behind the pillow drew his eye. A glint of red. He stepped closer. There, carefully folded and pressed under the pillow's edge as if waiting to be discovered, lay a piece of deep red velvet, not a scrap this time, but a full garment. Graves drew it out slowly. A dress, elegant floor-length, the kind worn to galas, to grand old theaters, to places far beyond the modest walls of a train car. It shimmered faintly in the weak light, a rich burgundy that soaked in shadow. The neckline was classic, sleeveless. A single thread was loose at the hem. It was completely out of place. No one on board had worn such a thing, he would have noticed. Everyone had traveled in sensible coats, shawls, winter suits, practical clothing for a winter journey. Nothing dramatic, nothing designed to turn heads. And now, here it was, in his cabin, hidden, waiting. He examined the fabric. No blood, no rips, no scent beyond a faint trace of perfumed jasmine, perhaps. Expensive, carefully chosen. This wasn't a clue left behind in a rush. It was a message. Graves laid the dress across the bed and stared at it. Someone had placed it there on purpose, in the victim's room. Not in their own luggage, but in the investigators' quarters. They wanted him to find it, to chase the wrong shadow, to question the wrong woman, to doubt what he'd already begun to suspect. A planted velvet dress, the same fabric found snagged on the murder cabins, would too obvious, too early. Graves folded the dress with gloved hands and sealed it in a garment bag, then set it in the overhead rack without a word. Someone on the midnight rail wanted to control the story, to stage not just a crime but a narrative, one where the killer could hide in plain sight, shielded by drama, misdirection, and a veil of red dot. But Graves knew stories, and stories always bled. Truth event. Chapter 10. The Broadway actress's tear. The storm outside had settled into a slow, constant whisper like the breath of something old, circling the stalled train with patient frost. Inside the midnight rail, warmth came not from the heating vents, but from the heavy curtains drawn shut against the void and the flickering yellow lamps, casting halos over everything. Elliot Graves stood at the door of cabin 5. Claire Whitmore, the once famous Broadway actress, had summoned him without words. Just a quiet note slipped beneath his door, written in looping cursive on the back of a theater program. I remember something. Please come. She sat now in a corner chair, wrapped in a long woolen shawl, her once golden hair silvered and pinned neatly behind her ears. Her eyes blue and distant watched the window, though there was nothing to see but the condensation of her own breathing. I heard it, she said softly, not turning. Last night, the scream. Graves waited. I wanted to open the door. I truly did, but I was afraid, so I closed my eyes, and I prayed. I whispered every line of the Lord's Prayer until my voice broke, and still the scream kept ringing. Her voice quivered, not with drama, but with memory. Graves nodded gently, saying nothing, letting silence open more doors than questions ever could. She finally looked at him, and the mask, the theatrical calm she wore like powder on her face, slipped, just enough for a tear to break free and roll silently into the folds of her shawl. Do you know what it's like to hear a sound you've tried to forget for decades? She asked. That sound. I heard it before, once, in a courtroom, in the back row, when they said not guilty. A mother screamed, and it was a sound so raw, so broken, it stopped every breath in the room. Graves leaned forward just slightly. Whose scream was it? Miss Whitmore. She closed her eyes. Not Miss Whitmore. He already knew. The voice was older now, but the bone structure, the shape of the eyes, the long fingers that had once clutched photographs in grief, they had all matched Claire Monroe, Emily's grandmother, the woman who'd raised the child while her daughter struggled through 2 jobs, the woman who'd walked with her to school every day, the one who identified the body when no one else could bear to look. You knew who Rousseau really was, Graves said softly but without doubt. Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to. Snow continued to fall, quiet, gentle, relentless. And in the silence that followed, Graves understood. This case hadn't started in cabin 3B. It had started decades ago, with a little girl, a scream in a courtroom, and a grandmother who had never stopped hearing it. Chapter 11. The doctor's hesitation. It was nearly noon, but the sky beyond the train windows still looked like dawn trapped in fog gray, colorless, uncommitted. The midnight rail remained motionless, as if frozen not just by snow, but by the weight of what it carried. Dr. Michael Avery was younger than most expected, a man, in his late 30s with soft eyes, careful hands, and the kind of voice that chose each word as though it might bruise if spoken too quickly. Graves found him in the observation car, hunched near a brass reading lamp, pretending to study a medical journal he hadn't turned the page of in an hour. You asked to speak again, Graves said. Avery nodded. I'm not sure it's important. Let me decide. The doctor set the journal down. I heard something last night, he said. Not the scream before that. A voice, maybe, a cough. Could have been anything. I was too tired to get up. Graves said nothing. Let silence scrape at the edges of the lie. Michael cleared his throat. I regret not checking. I keep thinking, what if I'd just looked? Maybe he'd still be alive. You're a doctor, Graves said, watching his hands. Guilt comes with the job, doesn't it? Michael managed a bitter smile. Yes, it does. Graves leaned forward just slightly. But you weren't always practicing in Boston, were you? That froze him. I've been in a few places, he replied, guarded, Ohio. The doctor looked up sharply. Graves continued, voiced calm, almost kind. You were the family physician for the Monroe family. You treated Emily, gave her flu shots, checked her for strep throat, once pulled a splinter from her hand when she was 5. Michael's face went pale. I saw the name in the old police files. Graves added, you testified during the trial, said you couldn't confirm evidence of prior injuries. But afterward, you moved, disappeared, changed hospitals, and now, here you are. Avery looked down at his hands. I never forgot her, he whispered. She was smart, always smiling, always asking questions. His voice cracked. We all failed her. Every adult in her life. Graves nodded slowly. That's becoming a pattern on this train, he said. People carrying more than luggage. People trying to outrun the past by chasing it. The doctor didn't respond. He didn't need to. The midnight rail was no longer just a luxury line. It had become a funeral procession, a slow-moving vessel through snow and memory, and every passenger carried a shadow shaped like a little girl who never made it home. Chapter 12. 12 blows, 12 fates. The door to cabin 3B creaked open once more. It had been hours since anyone entered. The body had long since been removed, carefully zipped into a black bag, taken to the train's cold storage compartment, but the room still carried the weight of death. The silence here was different. It didn't just feel empty. It felt observed. Elliot Graves stood alone in the narrow cabin, lit only by the cold afternoon light filtering through frosted glass. No longer distracted by the urgency of a fresh murder, he let his eyes move slowly, deliberately revisiting every bloodstain, every crease in the bedding, every unnatural detail. He wasn't looking for what was new. He was looking for what had been missed. The bunk's mattress still held a dark halo where Martin Russo Anthony Morello had bled. Graves crouched beside it, tracing the outline in his mind. Then he studied the blood spatter along the far wall, faint but irregular, like the angles were shifting. The hand that delivered the strikes hadn't stayed in one place. Graves reached into his coat and retrieved the photos he'd taken earlier, close-ups of the wounds, each marked and labeled. 12 stabs, no two were the same, some shallow, others deep, some clean, some jagged. One, delivered with left-handed force to the lower rib cage. Another almost surgical angled, just beneath the collarbone. A third punctured at an upward slant, the kind that came from someone shorter, or kneeling. That it no longer looked like rage. It looked like ritual. 12 blows, 12 decisions, 12 people who had not screamed, not run, not hesitated. Instead, they had taken turns. Graves stepped back, heart heavy with realization. This wasn't a solitary act of revenge. It was a shared sentence. Perhaps not everyone had struck, but someone had planned, someone had allowed, someone had watched. In silence, in grief, in perfect, wordless agreement. The man who had stolen a child's life hadn't been murdered by chance or by vengeance. Alone, he had been judged out by a jury that had waited in pain for years. And now, somewhere on this train, those 12 fates still sat quietly, sipping tea, reading newspapers, glancing through windows, pretending to be ordinary. Graves placed the photos back in his coat and closed the door behind him. He no longer needed to find who had killed Morello. He needed to find how far the silence had spread, and whether justice could survive the weight of 12 secrets carried in the snow. Chapter 13. The Case File of Emily Monroe. Elliot Graves sat alone in the Midnight Rail's service car, where the heat hummed inconsistently and the narrow desk wobbled with every shiver of the frozen rails. Outside, the snow stretched endlessly, a pale desert beneath a gray sky. The train hadn't moved in hours. Neither had the truth. He opened his leather-bound briefcase and removed a thin, worn folder, one he hadn't touched in years, but never forgot the feel of. The Case of Emily Monroe. Inside, a handful of documents, a school photo, a missing person flyer turned murder file, and a transcript from a trial that had never delivered peace. He placed the photo on the desk first. A child, 7 years old, freckles, a crooked smile, missing a front tooth. She wore a cardigan with one button undone and held a stuffed fox in her arms. The innocence in her face ached across time. Graves stared at it longer than he meant to. He remembered the headlines. Tragedy in Toledo. Parents pay. Daughter dies. A case that gripped a nation for 3 weeks, then faded quietly, shamefully, when justice was denied. He remembered standing in the back of the courtroom, a private investigator then, watching the defendants sit with the unearned calm of a man who knew the evidence against him was never quite enough. Anthony Morello, now dead, now reborn under a false name, had been the main suspect. He worked as a delivery driver, had seen the Monroe family's house on multiple routes. Police found trace amounts of Emily's hair in his van. A neighbor testified to seeing him near the house the night she was taken. He had no alibi, and yet the DNA samples were inconclusive. Chain of custody was botched. A key witness recanted, and in the end, the jury, faced with reasonable doubt, had set him free. Graves turned the page to the autopsy. Emily's BAFTA had been found in a drainage tunnel 5 days after the ransom was paid. No signs of struggle, no attempt to hide her. Just discarded, cold, and alone. Her watch still ticked on her wrist when she was found. The Monroe family, already fragile, shattered. The mother, Ellen, vanished from public life. Rumors said she attempted suicide more than once. The father, James, drowned himself in work until the marriage collapsed. The grandmother, Claire, once a prominent stage actress, withdrew entirely, reappearing only years later under a new name, Claire Whitmore, and now, impossibly, every one of them more. Those connected to them was on this train. Graves flipped to a list of known associates from the old file. Dr. Michael Avery, pediatrician present. Claire Monroe, guardian, present, the original investigating detective, now retired. He wasn't on the manifest, but Graves recalled a note about his daughter, now a diplomat's aide, possibly the young Asian woman in 6C. A sick recognition began to grow. They were all here, by chance, by fate, or by design. He opened another folder, a printout of the current passenger manifest. He began drawing lines, names, occupations, past connections. A theater actor once directed by Claire, a train attendant who once worked security at the courthouse where Morello was tried, a school teacher who had taught Emily in kindergarten, a widow whose husband had been on the jury that acquitted him. What began as coincidence was no longer. This train was not full of strangers, it was full of ghosts, tied to one girl's life and one man's escape from justice, and now that man was dead, not by random violence, not by fate, by judgment, by planning, by hands that carried scars for decades. Graves leaned back in the hard chair and exhaled slowly. The snowstorm outside might have stopped them physically, but this case had already been circling for years, gaining momentum in silence. The passengers of the midnight rail hadn't boarded to travel, they'd come to end something, a chapter left open, a scream unanswered, a child never mourned properly. The pieces were no longer scattered, they were in motion. The photo of Emily Monroe stared up at him, soft and unknowing, and Elliot Graves knew this wasn't a whodunit, this was a reckoning. Chapter 14. Secrets unfold. The midnight rail was still locked in winter's grip. The wheels sunk into a bed of frost, as if the earth itself refused to let it go. But inside the train, something had begun to stir, not in the movement of steel or coal, but in the space between people. Eyes lingered longer, voices hesitated more. The air had changed. Elliot Graves no longer walked the corridors as a mere investigator. He moved like a man peeling away wallpaper layer by layer, revealing a mural no one had meant to see again, that it was all there, hidden in names, folded into aliases, tucked inside compartments of silence and reinvention. The midnight rail, it turned out, was not a place of strangers. It was a reunion. Graves began with the woman who had introduced herself as Maria Elena, a soft-spoken Latin maid traveling with the wealthy Brighams. She had seemed invisible at first, ties down, posture low, the kind of presence that passed unnoticed. But Graves had learned to watch what others ignored. Her hands, for example, though she wore the plain gloves of a servant, her fingers bore the faint, faded scars of someone who had once held a child, often tiny crescent marks across the palm, the kind that came from catching sharp elbows, holding flailing arms during tantrums. He asked to speak with her privately. At first, she denied it. But when Graves gently set Emily Monroe's school photo on the table, her hands began to tremble. She didn't cry, didn't protest, just nodded once. "I was her nanny," she whispered, "since she was 2, not a maid. A memory keeper." Next, the Brighams, elegant, wealthy, unshakably polite. They had introduced themselves as art dealers from Connecticut, but in the file from 10 years ago, Graves found a different name, Walter and Lenora, Brighton godparents to Emily Monroe, longtime friends of the family, known for hosting holiday dinners and offering to pay for Emily's private school tuition. Before tragedy struck, when confronted, they didn't deny it. "We changed our name for peace," Walter said. It didn't work. The layers fell faster after that. The quiet nurse from cabin 4D, who had claimed she was traveling to visit a sister, turned out to be Emily's former babysitter, once called to testify about bruises she dismissed as accidents. The man, who claimed to be a retired school principal, had once driven the Monroe family's carpool, including the day Emily disappeared. He'd never been suspected, but he'd never forgiven himself either. Even the conductor, Frank Delaney's precise, had ties to the old case. His wife had worked in the police department during the investigation. She had been the one who found the ransom note on the family's porch. Graves saw her name in the old documents, and the moment he mentioned it, Frank closed his eyes and nodded, slow and sorrowful. "I begged her not to get involved," he said. "She couldn't sleep for years." Everywhere Graves turned, past and present collided. They had all come to the train with different stories, different disguises, but now the illusions began to crumble. He saw them as they really were, not random passengers, but pieces of Emily's lost world. Each had carried a fragment of the child, a laugh, a photo, a holiday gift, a single sentence spoken years ago that still haunted them. Some had been there in kindness, some in negligence, some in guilt, and all of them had boarded the midnight rail, as if drawn by a magnet buried in the snow. But it wasn't chance. Graves was sure of it now. Someone had gathered them, whether by invitation, coincidence, or silent consensus. They had converged, and when the snow trapped them in place, so too did memory. There was no going forward, no escaping back, only the present heavy with what had been done. 12 strikes, 12 presences, 12 secrets, unraveling like thread from a red velvet. Graves stood in the corridor as the train creaked softly around him. Through the narrow windows, he watched the falling snow blur the horizon into white nothingness. But inside the train, the world had never been sharper. Chapter 15. True Faces. The corridor lights flickered faintly as night pressed once again against the windows of the stranded midnight rail. A hush lay over the train, not the hush of sleep, but the kind that settled before a confession. Somewhere down the line, violin began to play on an old radio, muffled and trembling. Like it too was afraid of what the dark might bring. Elliot Graves stood in the narrow hallway, coat buttoned high, notebook in hand. As doors closed softly behind him one by one, names were falling apart. Masks unraveling like fabric pulled from decades of moth-eaten silence. The midnight rail had stopped moving, but its passengers had already arrived at the truth. Or at least, at the edge of it. They were not who they claimed to be. They had never been. From car to car, Graves retraced each step, revisiting each cabin with the weight of new knowledge. He no longer questioned motives. He studied faces and the quiet betrayals behind them. Maria Elena was not a traveling maid, but the woman who had sung Emily to sleep when her mother worked the late shift. Walter and Lenora Brigham were not art dealers, but the child's godparent who had tried to adopt her after the funeral only to be rejected by a grieving, angry mother. Dr. Michael Avery had never stopped being Emily's pediatrician. Claire Whitmore had once been Claire Monroe. Even the soft-spoken nurse, the kindly cook in the kitchen car. The young diplomats, Adolf, had ties that traced back to a girl with a missing front tooth and a stuffed fox in her arms. Their new names were veils, their professions, polite fiction. This was not a coincidence. This was a summoning. Graves returned to the lounge car, now quiet, save for the clinking of glass as someone stirred tea. He set his notes on the mahogany table and spread them out. Passenger manifest, handwritten aliases, old addresses, circled in red, trial transcripts, some stained by time, others by memory. One by one, he crossed out the false identities, and underneath, the true faces emerged like sketches from water. There were 12 people, bound not by blood, not by friendship, by grief. Some had loved Emily, some had failed her, and some, perhaps, had done both. It wasn't a pact, not officially. There was no letter passed around, no shadowy meeting beneath flickering lights. And yet, here they were, on the same train, during the same storm, in the same place where Anthony Morello, Emily's suspected killer, had been found stabbed 12 times, each wound different in depth, in angle, in intent. Graves felt a chill run through him, not from the cold, but from the precision. This was not revenge, that it was deliberation, planned, controlled, executed. And none of them had run, none had wept hysterically, or clutched at Graves with desperate pleas of innocence. They had remained still, calm, quiet, ready. Some had confessed, silently through eyes too weary to lie. Some still clung to the edges of their stories, hoping the snow might bury what remained. But the train had become a vessel not of escape, but of confrontation. And Graves was no longer a detective solving a murder. He was a witness to a reckoning. He looked again at the photo of Emily on the table, her smile, her unbrushed bangs, her bright clumsy joy, a child stolen, a family shattered, and now 12 pieces of that broken life sat scattered through this train, waiting not to be caught but to be understood. Graves closed his notebook slowly. The storm outside was thinning. Soon, the tracks would clear. The midnight rail would lurch forward, pretending this had only been a delay. But something irreversible had happened in this frozen capsule of pain and silence. The truth had taken root, not in the courtroom where justice failed, not in the headlines that forgot, but here, in the snow, among those who had never moved on, and beneath every polite nod, every borrowed name, every folded ticket, there was a face Graves could finally see. Chapter 16. The Silent Agreement. The snowfall had softened, and yet, The midnight rail remained still, as though the storm had passed, but no one dared be the first to move. Inside the train, the silence no longer felt born of shock or fear. It had changed shape. It was now deliberate, held, maintained, like a pact. Elliot Graves felt it the moment he opened the door to the dining car again. Conversations had ceased. The clink of silverware was minimal, movements slow, as though each passenger had been lowered into a delicate ritual. No voices rose, no accusations flew, yet every face turned to him briefly, subtly, and then turned away just as quickly. He was not the intruder. He was the observer they had expected. The ones who remained, maybe 13, watched him with eyes that did not fear exposure. They had already faced themselves. That much was clear. What remained was not defense, but endurance. Graves moved from cabin to cabin once more, not with the sharp interrogation of a lawman, but the careful cadence of a man navigating a church during prayer. No door was slammed in his face. No questions were met with outrage. They welcomed him, even smiled softly at his arrival. But beneath every smile was a wall of silence. He sat across from the Brighams again. Walter offered him tea. Lenora spoke about the weather. They answered questions with precision, politeness, but nothing new. Not one word more than the record could hold. Not one slip, not one detail that would unravel the fragile threads holding them together. Claire Whitmore, once the proud actress, once a grieving grandmother, now simply a woman in winter, met his gaze steadily. Some stories, she said, are told in silence. The doctor, the nanny, the driver rule echoed the same quiet rhythm. Their answers held just enough truth to keep suspicion calm, and just enough restraint to keep guilt unproven. It was not collusion. It was something older, something sacred. Graves realized it was not a spoken agreement that bound them. It was pain, the kind of pain that scabbed over with time, only to crack open all at once. Years later, in the middle of a snowstorm, they had not written letters to each other. They had not gathered in secret places. But when they saw the name, Morello again, perhaps buried in a manifest, perhaps whispered in rumor, they had felt the same pulse, and they had boarded. Willingly. Graves looked around the car. 12 people, all connected by a life lost and a verdict that never healed. He remembered something from his childhood, a story his father had told him, a detective himself once, back when trains ran slower and justice ran colder. Some wounds never want a trial, they want a burial. Now, Graves understood. This wasn't about uncovering who had held the knife. It was about understanding why 12 people had carried that blade together, one way or another, through the years. Each had bled in their own fashion. Each had lived with absence, with guilt, with the ache of a child's voice that had stopped too soon. So now, they had made peace the only way the world had left them, together, and in silence. Graves wrote in his notebook, I ask questions. They give me what they can, but the truth is not in their answers, it's in their restraint. And yet, not all silence is equal, he knew, as he moved through the cabins, that not everyone was at peace. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had gathered the names, tracked the paths, ensured that every face that mattered was seated on this train, perhaps not with threats, but with invisible strings, letters, hints, coincidences that were anything but. There was a conductor behind the conductor, and as Graves felt the quiet of the train stretch into something nearly holy, he also felt a chill, because silence, when it is shared, becomes a language of its own, and in that language, someone was still speaking. Chapter 17. The train stands still. The midnight rail had not moved in hours. Outside, the world was suspended in white. A thick, heavy stillness blanketed the land, erasing all traces of motion. Trees bowed under the weight of the storm. Fences vanished into drifts. Even time, it seemed, had agreed to pause. Inside, the lamps burned low. Elliot Graves sat alone in the observation car, his gloved hands wrapped around a mug of no-cold coffee, his breath fogging faintly against the window. He could no longer feel the difference between minutes and hours. The storm had become a mirror, not a prison. It reflected back not where the train had stopped, but why. There was nothing left to interrogate, no new secrets to unearth. The passengers, maybe 13, had grown still, not in fear, but in readiness, as though each of them had delivered what was owed, and now waited for the final accounting. Only one question remained. What does justice look like when it comes to late? Graves turned back to his notes. Pages and pages of names, connections, lies, truths, confessions folded into silences, a map of broken hearts and closed doors. He had never encountered a case like this, not in all his years. Following blood trails and missing children and the things adults tried to bury. This one had no single suspect, no singular act. It was not a puzzle dot, it was a mourning ritual. Martin Russo Anthony Morello was not murdered by one person, but by the unbearable weight of 12 stories left unresolved. A life destroyed, a truth denied, a justice system that had raised its hands and turned away. What remained had been carved into the flesh of a man who had walked free, and then found himself trapped in a train full of ghosts. And now, Graves was the last to decide what it all meant. Officially, he had the authority. He could radio ahead, call the Chicago PD, bring the train under custody. He could hand over the names, file the reports, let the courts try again to find a version of the truth palatable to the law. He could choose order, or he could choose truth. He stared at his own reflection in the darkened glass. Behind him, the seats were empty. Somewhere, in the cabins, people sat with folded hands and quiet eyes, waiting not for justice, but for understanding. What would justice serve now? Would a second trial undo the ache? Would a prison sentence erase a decade of silence? Would handcuffs restore a child who had once held her nanny's finger and giggled at the snow? Graves closed his eyes. He thought of Emily, not the case file version, not the grainy photo, but the human image built from everything the passengers had said without saying it. She had loved apple slices and hated mornings. She had cried when her parents argued. She had once wanted to be a veterinarian. She had never made it to her 8th birthday, and all those who had carried her loss had done so in fragments, shards of guilt and memory stitched together not in hatred, but in absence. Their silence was not cowardice, it was grief given shape. The train groaned softly as wind brushed the outer walls. Somewhere in the dining car, a fork clinked gently against a porcelain plate, and then nothing. Graves picked up his pen. On the final page of his notebook, he wrote only this: the snow was thick, the road impassable. The suspect died during the storm. Witnesses report no foul play. Case closed due to natural causes. He set the notebook down. He would not lie, but he would not betray what had occurred. The midnight rail would continue when the snow allowed it. They would arrive in Chicago. People would disembark, scatter into the bustle of city life, disappear again into the rhythm of forgetting. The world would keep turning, but here, in this stretch of white silence between towns, between justice and mercy, something had ended, and something had been made whole, not by punishment, but by presence. Graves stood slowly, coat creaking at the shoulders, and walked through the train, nodding silently to those he passed. A few nodded back, others simply lowered their eyes, but they understood, so did he. Chapter 18. A killer from outside. The wind outside had quieted, but the stillness remained pressing softly against the walls of the midnight rail like an unasked question. Snow drifted in lazy spirals beyond the windows. Inside, the train had taken on the quiet rhythm of contemplation. Conversations were whispers, now. Movements hushed. It was no longer a vessel, it had become a memory in motionless form. Detective Elliot Graves sat at a table in the lounge car, a pencil in his fingers, its tip resting on a blank page. He had not slept, he had barely spoken, but now there was a decision to make. Not of guilt or innocence. He already knew what had happened, but of narrative. Which story would the world hear? The facts were, technically, flexible. A man had been murdered in a locked cabin. There were no fingerprints. No murder weapon was recovered. No footprints in the snow. No broken window. No sign of forced entry. Except for one thing, a theory. Graves could craft it easily. He could paint a picture, cold and clinical. Sometime during the night, an unknown assailant, possibly a stowaway or a saboteur-urgent entry to the train during the emergency stop. The storm covered their tracks. They committed the murder and escaped unnoticed while passengers were asleep or distracted by the weather. The motive is unclear. He paused. He could even invent a suspect. A shadowy figure seen by no one, a blurred footprint near the cargo hold, a loose latch on the rear door. There were enough shadows in the folds of the train to give such a fiction a spine. He could give the police a villain, someone to chase, something to announce. Justice, postponed but still upright, still alive in the eyes of reporters and courtrooms. But the truth refused to dress itself in such clean lines. Graves leaned back, the pencil rolling from his hand onto the table. He had seen their eyes, each passenger with their own story stitched into silence. Not one of them had lied, not exactly, but all had told only part of what they knew. It wasn't an agreement of words, but a collective choreography of withholding, a dance of restraint. And behind it all, the invisible hands that had brought them together. He stood slowly and walked to the rear of the lounge, where the window overlooked the last car. Snow fell in endless, silent strands, layering the world in white forgetfulness. He whispered to the window, as if to someone listening just beyond the glass. Was it easier if the killer came from outside? He imagined the 12 passengers nodding yes. Let it be a stranger, a madman from the storm, a faceless evil that entered, took what it wanted, and vanished. Let that be the story. Let the world go on believing that monsters wear masks, that they do not ride beside you in silence, or hand you coffee in the morning, or help fold blankets in the sleeping car. But Graves knew better. The killer had not come from the cold. The killer had come from memory. He walked back to his notes and scribbled one final theory, not to file, not to speak aloud, but to carry. The murder of Anthony Morello was committed by no single person. It was the culmination of grief held too long by too many. The weapon was not a knife, it was time. If he chose, the stranger in the snow story, the world would nod and turn the page. If he told the truth that grief had planned, and memory had stabbed, then the world might ask harder questions about justice, about forgiveness, about what people become when truth is too heavy to carry alone. He stared at both versions of the story. Then, like a man at a crossroad, he folded one page and slipped it into his coat pocket. The other, he left blank. He would tell the authorities what they needed to hear, but he would carry the truth in silence. The midnight rail would move again soon. Outside, the snow began to slow. Inside, the passengers sat quietly, some with books, some with hands clasped, some watching their reflections in the darkened windows. They were waiting, not for absolution, but for the silence to be honored. And Graves, who had once believed truth must always be spoken, now understood something deeper. Some truths must only be known. Chapter 19. Collective Justice. The train exhaled a gentle groan as it settled deeper into the snow. The rails, once humming with purpose, now lay silent beneath a shroud of white, and inside the motionless world of the midnight rail, Elliot Graves sat still alone with a revelation that no longer whispered at the edges of his thoughts, but stood before him, fully formed. He stared at the murder file once more, but this time, it was not Martin Russo's name that held his gaze. It was Emily Monroe's. Her face had never left him, not since the first quiet conversation, not since the red velvet dress, not since the trembling voice of a grandmother folded in grief. Piece by piece, the mystery had not unraveled, it had gathered, condensed, until the weight of it could no longer be carried as theory. It had to be accepted as truth. 12 stab wounds, 12 people. Each wound had its own angle, its own depth, its own intent. Not wild, not random, but carefully placed, each strike as if rehearsed in memory for years. The path of the blade had not followed one person's rage, but 12 people's pain. This had not been murder in the ordinary sense. This was collective justice. He rose from the desk and walked slowly toward the sleeping compartments. The hallway stretched long and hushed, lights dimmed, footsteps softened by carpet. He passed the doors not as an officer of the law, but as a man moving through a chapel of ghosts. Each cabin held someone who had loved her, not always closely, not always obviously, but somewhere in their lives they had felt the impact of Emily's absence. The nanny who watched her vanish from a park bench, the doctor who failed to find the evidence, the grandmother who wept in court, the chauffeur who blamed himself for looking away at the wrong moment. Each one had been scarred in silence. Each had lived with a question that never received an answer, so they came together not by a pact, not by conspiracy, but by a shared fracture. And on this train, that fracture had become a mirror. Graves leaned against the wall outside cabin 3, be now empty, now sealed on. Let the truth breathe. They had all struck the blow, not as killers, but as carriers of something that had festered for years. Some had struck with anger, others with trembling hands. Some, perhaps, not at all, but had watched, allowed, accepted. It wasn't about vengeance. Not really. It was about balance, about reclaiming something that had been denied when Morello walked free, about lifting the weight that had made them different people, quieter, colder, less whole. It had not brought justice to the world, but it had brought peace to them. Graves walked again, past the sleeping car, past the lounge, until he reached the very front of the train. There, in the engineer's booth, the controls lay idle. The radio buzzed faintly with static. Chicago was still many hours away. He placed his hand on the window, watching snow melt beneath his palm. He whispered, "One man died, but the killer was a memory shared by 12, and the motive was not hate. It was love twisted by time." He knew what the law would say. 12 assailants, conspiracy to murder, life sentences, names in headlines, faces in courtrooms, another family ruined. But he also knew this wasn't a case the world could try, because the real culprit was not on this train. It had died with Emily Monroe. The real culprit was a trauma, and tonight, those who had carried it had returned it. Like mourners at a graveyard, laying down flowers and tears. No celebration, no triumph, just breath and release. Graves stepped back from the glass and took one last look down the hallway. They would never speak of it, and neither would he. Chapter 20. The train moves again. It happened slowly, so slowly, in fact, that no one felt it at first. The faintest shudder beneath the floor, a quiet vibration in the teaspoon resting beside an untouched cup. Then the creak of metal, a groan, and finally a low hum rising from deep within the belly of the midnight rail. The train had begun to move again. Outside, the storm had passed. Snow still lay thick along the plains of Missouri, blanketing the earth in a deceptive calm, but the skies had cleared, and somewhere beyond the white, tracks had emerged like threads stitching the world back together. The passengers did not cheer. There were no smiles, no chatter, no sudden lurch to the windows. The movement was not triumph, was release. They had waited in the stillness for something greater than weather, and now that it had passed through them, each carried the echo of it in their eyes. In the dining car, the senator sipped tea without sugar. The former nurse stared at her hands, as if she had only now remembered they existed. Claire Whitmore, longer hiding behind her stage name, held her rosary in silence, the beads moving without prayer. Even the engineer at the front barely acknowledged the shift. He had received the go-ahead from the dispatcher. The line was clear. He set the throttle gently, like a man stirring a dream back into motion. Elliot Graves stood at the edge of the observation car, watching the trees begin to slide past the windows once more. His coat hung from his shoulders like a priest's, vestment heavy with the knowledge he had chosen not to speak aloud. Justice had been done, but it wore no uniform. It had passed no sentence in court. It had not asked for permission, and it had not waited for proof. It had come on snow-covered feet, in the night, and spoken through trembling hands. The midnight rail pressed forward, its wheels singing low against the track, a lullaby to the silence left behind. The cabins were dim. Some passengers sat in meditation. Others had returned to bed, not to sleep, but to remember. No one looked at anyone too long. Eye contact was fragile now, too full of what could not be said. The murder was behind them. So was the truth. Graves understood now. He had not been called to solve a crime. He had been called to witness an absolution. Not the kind given by laws and judges, but the kind that only happens when hearts rupture together, and still manage to beat. He took out his notebook once more, turned to a blank page, and wrote a final line, not for the report, not for the case file, but for himself. Justice is not always blind. Sometimes it sees everything and chooses silence. The train picked up speed. Snow gave way to iron, iron to gravel, gravel to towns waiting in the distance. The passengers would disembark as planned. No one would be arrested. No one would be interviewed. The story would remain a storm-born mystery to those outside its walls. But inside, those who had lived it would remember. They would return to their lives as different versions of themselves. Lighter, perhaps, or just emptier. And Graves, for all his questions, would carry only one answer, that some crimes cannot be punished, only understood. Chapter 21. Nearing Chicago. The sun, pale and low, stretched its golden fingers across the horizon as the midnight rail wound its way through the outer suburbs of Chicago. Snow still clung to the rooftops and telephone wires, but its edges had begun to melt, giving way. Two soft drips, muddy slush, and the gray promise of the waking city. Inside the train, time moved slower than the engine. Each passenger, wrapped in quiet routine, seemed to feel the weight of proximity. The journey was almost over, not just in miles, but in meaning. What had been endured on these tracks would never be spoken again, and so they held tighter to their silence, afraid that the truth might slip free before the doors opened at Union Station. Elliot Graves sat in the corner booth of the dining car, untouched coffee cooling in front of him. His notebook lay open, a thin line of graphite scribbled across the last page. Sometimes, justice does not require a courtroom. Sometimes, it does not even require a name. Sometimes, it just requires 12 hearts to beat together, not in vengeance, but in memory. The words stared back at him, quiet and unblinking. He had written them not as a conclusion, but as a confession. He had chosen to say nothing, not to protect the guilty, but to preserve the fragile thing that had been created on that snowy night. Not revenge, but balance. A world slightly repaired, not by law, but by shared grief. He could feel it around him still, in the way the elderly man in the window seat no longer trembled when the train jolted, in the way the nurse now met his eyes, instead of lowering her own. In the way Claire Whitmore had finally stopped clutching the rosary, and let it rest on the table between her fingers. One by one, they were returning to themselves. Not whole, but no longer haunted. He stood and walked through the length of the train, nodding once to the conductor, once to the porter, once to a woman folding a coat she would not need again today. Outside the window, buildings began to multiply: warehouses, brick apartments, bridges spanning over frozen rivers. Chicago was no longer a dot on the map. It was a presence, a breath waiting to be drawn. Graves stopped just short of his cabin and placed his hand on the cold brass handle. He took a breath, not for courage but to say goodbye. To the train. To the case. To Emily. There would be no press conference, no arrest. No file submitted with fanfare. He would return to his office. He would draft a report. He would say that the murder was likely the act of a mysterious intruder who escaped during the snowstorm. He would add that without further evidence, the case remained unsolved, and no one would question it, because the world he knew preferred simple answers. But the truth would remain with him. It would ride in the pocket of his coat, in the scratch of his pencil, in the way he looked at strangers in crowded places and wondered what stories they carried that no one could see. The train gave one final sigh as it curved around the last bend before the station. Passengers began to gather their belongings. Bags were lifted. Coats shrugged on. And slowly, with the ritual of all endings, they prepared to leave. None of them looked back. Graves closed his notebook and stepped into the aisle. The platform waited, and so did the silence. Chapter 22. As the passengers depart, the midnight rail exhaled a long sigh as it glided into Union Station beneath the skeletal shadows of the Chicago skyline. Steel met steel with a gentle shudder, not the jarring break of a hurried arrival, but the exhale of something ancient, something finished. Inside the train, no one moved at first. It was as if the passengers had momentarily forgotten how to rejoin the world. The journey had altered them, stripped them of more than just time, and now, returning felt like trespassing into a life they had left behind in New Orleans before the snow, before the silence, before the truth. Then, quietly, the motion began. A coat buttoned. A suitcase lifted. A soft voice thanked the porter. Elliot Graves remained still, standing just beside the exit vestibule, hands resting at his sides, face calm, unreadable. He wasn't there as a detective anymore. He was there as something else, a witness to something unspoken, yet deeply understood. One by one, the passengers passed him, and one by one, they left him something, nothing as crude as a confession or as plain as gratitude. Just gestures, a nod from the old nurse, her eyes no longer searching for forgiveness, a whispered take care from the once nervous maid, who had knelt beside a crib decades ago and failed to stop the clock. A fleeting glance from the family doctor, whose silence had once betrayed a family and now sealed their mourning. They did not linger. Each step down the metal stair was deliberate. Each footfall on the platform was a benediction. It wasn't just the end of a journey. It was the end of a ritual. Graves felt it like incense hanging in a church after the parishioners had gone. He nodded in retolent slowly to each. And when Claire Whitmore passed, no longer Claire Monroe, no longer hiding behind stage lights or fiction, she paused not to speak, but to press a small rosary into his hand. It was warm, worn, and missing one bead. She looked at him, eyes lined with the sadness of a woman who had outlived too much, and then she smiled not with joy, but with release. Then she turned and walked away. And so it went, one by one, 12 passengers, 12 sorrows, 12 silent verdicts. And when the platform was quiet again, when the doors had shut behind them and their shadows were gone, Graves stepped off the train and stood beneath the station's high glass ceiling. People bustled past, lives continuing, questions unanswered. No one knew what had happened in the snow. And no one ever would. The station smelled of coffee and engine oil. Loudspeakers crackled with arrivals and departures. Suitcases rolled. Children laughed. Announcements echoed across marble floors. But within Graves, a different silence remained. Not cold, not cruel, but sacred. Something had been buried on that train, not just a body, not just a man named Morello, but the final remnants of a grief too old for words. And those who had carried it had walked away lighter, emptier, but whole. The world would not mark the day. There would be no monument, no article, no memory shared outside the circle of those who had lived it. And yet, Graves would remember. He would remember the snow. The 12 wounds, the 12 faces, and the quiet, unwavering justice that had passed through the corridors of a moving train like a ghost, with no need to haunt again. Chapter 23. Silent Press. The headlines the next morning were unremarkable. Winter storm delays midnight rail. Read one column in the Chicago Tribune. Boffin taken ill on train from New Orleans. Announced another, buried near the weather report. No investigations. No images of crime scenes. Just a few brief sentences about a seasonal delay and an unnamed man who had been unwell during transit and later found deceased in his cabin. The city turned its page. The story vanished beneath. More urgent ink. Politics, markets, a mayoral scandal. The news cycle swallowed the journey whole, chewed it into forgettable trivia, and moved on without a single ripple of truth. But that was exactly how it had been designed. Elliot Graves sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn low against the sun. The soft ticking of the wall clock was the only sound. On his desk lay a folder, thin, neat, and perfectly incomplete. He had filed the report as promised. The body of Martin Russo, also known as Anthony Morello, had been found under mysterious circumstances. No witnesses, no suspects, no signs of forced entry. A potential cardiac event, possibly exacerbated by altitude, cold, and stress. No foul play determined. Case closed, pending new evidence. There would be no new evidence. The train had been wiped, clean not of fingerprints, not of facts, but of narrative. Every detail that might have raised a question had been softened, altered, erased by omission. The passengers had given no statements. The conductor had seen nothing. Even the train company's internal notes referred only to an unfortunate medical incident. Graves sipped lukewarm coffee, his fingers resting lightly on the closed file. He did not feel guilt. He felt alignment. Justice had not needed a spotlight this time. It had not worn the costume of courtrooms and verdicts. It had moved quieter, like snow over tracks covering everything equally, leaving no trace but the feeling beneath your feet. The press, in its hunger for spectacle, had missed the story entirely. Or perhaps it had sensed something and chosen to avert its eyes. Either way, the truth now lived only in fragment scraps of memory, floating in the minds of a dozen strangers who would likely never speak again. Somewhere in the city, they were waking up, folding laundry, feeding pets, stepping out onto porches to check the mail, each of them holding a sliver of what had happened. Each of them living differently now, maybe smiling more, or crying less, or simply breathing without the heaviness they had carried for far too long, and no one would know why. That was the power of silence. That was the power of letting something end without applause. Graves closed his notebook slowly and tucked it into the drawer. The rosary Claire had given him still sat on the corner of the desk, its missing bead like a scar that had faded but would never vanish. He didn't need reminders. He had watched the trial unfold. Not in a courtroom, but in the hallways of a snowbound train. He had heard the testimonies in glances, in trembling hands, in the reverent quiet after the deed was done. He had seen the jury walk away not as victors, but as survivors. No gavel had fallen, no names had been etched into the record, and yet a verdict had been rendered. Now, outside his office window, the city moved on. Cars passed, buses hissed at stoplights. A man argued with a cab driver over fare. A woman in a red coat dropped her glove and a stranger returned it with a smile. Life was indifferent to the secrets it carried, and the midnight rail. It was already en route to another destination, filled with new passengers, new names, new stories. But somewhere within its bones, the echoes remained soft, sacred, and unpublished. Chapter 24. The Detective's Keepsake. Union Station had emptied with the slow rhythm of a clock winding down. The platforms that had once trembled with footsteps now held only the soft echo of memories. Like breath trapped between steel pillars and marble walls, Detective Elliot Graves lingered. He stood alone, far from the crowds, in a quiet corner of the platform where the scent of oil and old snow still hung in the air. The train was long gone, its taillights fading into distance and anonymity, but the weight of its passage still rested on his shoulders, as if the rails themselves had whispered something to him, and vanished before he could answer. He slipped his hand into the inner pocket of his coat, not from habit, but from instinct. Fingers touched cloth. Soft aged. He drew it out slowly, as if fearing it might dissolve in the sunlight. A handkerchief, cream-colored, edged with lace, barely holding together at the seams. Time had yellowed it, and the folds bore the memory of someone who once pressed it to her lips, perhaps to silence a sob, or to hold back a scream she could never release. Embroidered in one corner, with delicate precision, were the initials E.M. Emily Monroe. Graves turned the fabric over gently in his hand. He hadn't remembered placing it in his pocket. Perhaps it had been slipped there by Claire, or left in his cabin unnoticed. Perhaps the train itself had chosen to give him something to hold on to. The thread of those initials shimmered faintly in the morning light. E.M., a name that had once belonged to a little girl with braids in storybooks, a child taken before her voice could grow strong enough to defend herself, a soul folded away and nearly forgotten by a world too distracted to listen. Now, she lived here in this soft square of cloth, in the silence of 12 passengers, and in a murder no court would ever record. Graves closed his hand around it, not with possession, but with reverence. It was not evidence, it was a relic, a final trace of a story that had never been told fully, never needed to be. And somehow, despite the blood, despite the snow, despite the cold geometry of law, the ending had found its own shape, soft, uneven, and utterly human. He looked up. The sky above the station roof was pale and colorless, the kind of sky that made no promises. But beneath it, something had shifted in him. He no longer felt like the man who boarded that train in New Orleans. That man had believed in cause and effect. This man believed in consequence. He tucked the handkerchief back into his pocket, carefully, not to forget, but to carry it forward, like a bookmark in a chapter no one else would ever read. There was nothing more to be said. The world around him resumed its noise. Announcements echoed. A train pulled into another platform. A child laughed, and Graves turned away, his coat catching the wind like the trailing note of a song no one else remembered. But in his pocket, Emily Monroe remained, not as a victim, not as a case, but as a memory stitched in thread, warm against his chest. Chapter 25. The True File. The detective's office was dim, its windows muted by dust and the gray hush of a cloudy afternoon. Somewhere outside, Chicago stirred with its usual sounds: distant sirens, the low hum of traffic, the occasional call of a street vendor. But here, in this small square of silence, Elliot Graves sat perfectly still. The desk in front of him was bare, except for one item, a black leather-bound notebook. Its corners were softened by time, the pages thick with ink and pauses. He had filled it slowly, never in haste, never for spectacle, not with theories or dramatic conclusions, but with quiet truths, observations, details others would never notice, the kind of things you only see when you let silence lead. He took a breath and flipped to the final page. The ink moved easily. In clean, deliberate script, he wrote 3 lines. Case name, Midnight Rail, murder status, closed notes, justice served, no trial required. He paused, then underlined the final sentence once, lightly, no flourish. It was the closest thing to a verdict this story would ever have. He reached for a simple, white label from the drawer and pressed it to the spine of the notebook. With a pencil, he etched one final note across the surface. Closed, justice delivered, no court involved, not for filing, not for others, just for him. Then, with a breath no one heard, he gently closed the book, and in that soft motion, the weight, Of the journey, the snowbound train, the whispers in the corridor, the red velvet, the 12 silent hearts folded itself into stillness. Graves didn't rise immediately. He let the silence hold him. One last time. It wasn't the kind of silence that followed tragedy, or the silence that preceded fear. It was something different. The kind that exists after the truth is spoken, but only to yourself. The kind that lingers in churches after the congregation has gone, or in a child's bedroom long after bedtime stories have ended. He stood, reached for his coat, and with careful fingers placed the notebook into the bottom drawer of his cabinet, not locked, but private, a chamber for truths that the world would never need to see to know they had mattered. Then he turned toward the door. His steps were slow, thoughtful. He passed the coat rack, the faded map of Amtrak lines pinned to the wall, the framed photograph of his old partner who had once said, "Some cases don't want solving, they want understanding." At the threshold, Graves paused and glanced back once, not to reconsider, but to remember. Then he left. No farewell, no press conference, no summary, just the quiet fall of his footsteps echoing through the corridor, and the faint creak of the outer door closing behind him. Outside, the world continued. Taxis blinked at the curb. A woman hurried down the sidewalk, coat flaring like wings. Somewhere, a train pulled out of the station, its horn low and long, like a final breath, let out into the gray, and Elliot Graves walked on, no longer carrying the mystery, only the memory.